Welcome to Santa Barbara Talks with Josh Molina. It's my pleasure today to be here with Dr. Daraka Larimore-Hall, who I like to call a friend. I've known him a long time. I was covering him back in my early newspaper reporter days in Santa Barbara. And Daraka is a local kid who's very influential now in the local Democratic Party as well as the statewide Democratic Party. And he's also just a phenomenal, spectacular talker, debater, orator. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of that today. Daraka, how are you?
I'm good, though I feel like any answer to that question right now needs like an asterisk or a parenthetical. Like I'm good considering that it still feels like we're in the middle of the end of the world.
Yeah, well, we're obviously in very, very turbulent times. And so one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show was to just sort of pick your brain and talk to you a little bit about what's going on locally, nationally, the state of politics. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the media. You and I have had some long conversations, back and forth text messages about this, the state of local journalism and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to just kind of talk to you. Let's start off with the Santa Barbara County Democratic Party. I know this is an issue that you and I have talked about over the years, and I've done my fair share of stories that sort of look at like what is the party machine doing and how are they impacting local elections, and why do they try to clear the field and sort of set everything up, and there doesn't leave somebody else to come in, and that narrative's kind of played out, but it still pops up every election cycle. You for a long time were the chair of the party, and now you're working on statewide stuff, which we'll talk about. But can we talk a little bit about the strength, the state of the Santa Barbara County Democratic Party? We are entering a mayoral election coming up, and we're just coming off a big election. Talk to me a little bit about the party and where it stands today.
Sure. Well, that's great. And it's nice to have an opportunity to just kind of talk about this stuff in a little bit of a longer form and not try to do it in sort of newspaper sound bites, which is the way that we generally talk about it and talk about parties. And one of the things that you and I have talked about, right, because you're an educator and you teach people about how to do journalism, and I'm off and on a professional educator, but kind of always trying to teach in one way or another about how politics works. And sometimes those things clash, right? Because I'm very much want people to be able to pick up a newspaper and get real facts about how the system works and so forth. And honestly, like, I think we all have to do a lot of thinking about how we got to the situation we're at right now as a country. And I think, we could talk about it. I think there are parts of, the activist left, or things that the activist left have done that have, not been helpful or even contributed to it. But I also think in journalism, or the way that the media covers parties, is as it has also helped get us to Trump. It got us to Schwarzenegger. It got us to a lot of weird things. And it comes down to this question: like, are parties a legitimate part of the democratic process, or are they like this alien outside force that tries to pervert it? And I strongly believe that parties are a legitimate and really vital part of how democracy actually works. And that's a very widespread, very uncontroversial opinion in political science or in political sociology. And I'd say it's also like how pundits kind of assume politics is, but there's always this other narrative that like being partisan is bad. Organizations getting together and trying to influence politics as an organization, that must be suspect. And I think that's based on a really naive idea of how power works in society. This idea that there's just these people and they run for office and they're like, hey, vote for me because I'm cool. And then people are like, is he cool? Is she cool? And then they go and vote, and then policy happens. And we're all like, oh, that's democracy. But in reality, right, there's organized forces around, in a town, how we're going to use land, real estate interests and farm interests and so forth. And like those interests have power in society, not just in money they give to politicians, but also in like deciding whether housing gets built or not. And so politicians actually have to make decisions based on groups of people and interests and so forth. And parties are a really important way that amateurs, regular citizens, and in California, residents can engage in that process meaningfully and have influence over it other than being a politician themselves or just a voter. So the thing in a place like Santa Barbara, or actually in California too, right, is that most people, or the majority of people, are Democrats. So there's competition for positions, you know, seats on city council or whatever, but also competition ideologically or over policy among Democrats. And so then you have to have a mechanism and a system for like sorting out those differences. Who gets to run for this position, or where is the party going to be on affordable housing? And then the party has to make decisions. And so we have a system, we have a structure in which, you know, everyone who's a registered Democrat gets to participate in lots of different ways that makes those decisions. But then you get, you know, it's just funny and ironic because then you get people, and I think this is the segue into like juicy stuff you want to talk about local politics, right? But it's like you get just these people making these arguments that a publicly elected group of people representing Democrats all over the county deciding who's the official Democrat in a race is not legitimate. That's a cabal. That's evil Daraka and his henchmen. But like a totally self-appointed network that's like a woman who bought a newspaper in Montecito and this person with wealth and this other person, like a network like that getting together and being like, this issue is going to be about, or this election is going to be about marijuana, and this is our candidate. Like that's a grassroots democratic ideal in the eyes of like Jerry Roberts or whatever. And I think that's just fakakta. Like that's oligarchy. Like who gets to have the loudest voice is not democracy. And in fact, in a democracy, people have to come together and organize in ways that are like public and accountable. Anyway, that's a long rant, but the fact is that it's just maddening to pick up a local newspaper, and this is like getting everybody locally off the hook. Same thing happens state level, national level, and you see things like partisan and party activists talked about like their freaking cult, you know, leaders. And yet anybody who comes up and is like, I'm post-partisan and I just want to get things done, you know, people line up and are like, woo. And then we're surprised that, oh, it was like this, you know, action movie star that didn't know jack shit about politics.
So let me ask you a little bit about this idea that, you know, electeds who elect.
Sorry, I think we've got a delay there.
Yeah, it's one of those distance learning, virtual. I got 2 kids who are on Zoom, so that might happen. Hopefully we don't go all out entirely here. But let me ask you sort of this concept, though, and I'm going to simplify it and boil it down. So everything you said makes sense, that the right of, you know, elected people who represent the party, their ability to endorse and support a candidate to run. That makes sense. The question is, what about that candidate who's not connected, who doesn't network, who is sort of strong, who for whatever reason doesn't find the right people within the Democratic Party organization, but is a good candidate? And then this is where people get upset, is that you've got a good Democrat versus somebody who's been playing the party game for a while. And by game, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. Okay. I mean that they've been involved, they've been participating, they know the players. And then you've got somebody who just didn't know about that path and they have good ideas. What space is there for that candidate? Let's take Kristen Sneddon. Let's take Kristen Sneddon.
Okay. Let's take Kristen Sneddon.
Okay.
Let's take Kristen Sneddon. Kristen Sneddon said that she decided to run for city council like a bunch of gazillion months before she announced or whatever, at a big meeting full of all of the most well-connected and powerful Democratic women, which is a big, you know, plurality of Democratic movers and shakers in Santa Barbara, like surrounded by people, then talked to a bunch of politicians who said, yeah, you'd be awesome, you should run. And then didn't do anything about that. And then even after we started the process, was like, started the endorsement process and everything, I decided not to avail herself of the endorsement process. Second, you just said a bunch of things that are a bunch of assumptions. A good Democrat, good on the issues, etc. How the hell did we know that? Mm-hmm. When we didn't get a questionnaire, we don't have an interview with this person. All we know is she's a registered Democrat and she wants to run for office. And the whole point of having a party is being a registered Democrat and wanting to run for office isn't enough to be supported by the Democratic Party. And you keep, or there's this mantra that goes on because there's like a candidate who doesn't get endorsed, or a candidate who, what's his name, he ran for mayor, and Hal Conklin, right? Mm-hmm. Who like had been on the city council, was best friends with everybody, with Doss Williams and Laura Capps, and is like the most connected dude in Santa Barbara, then was like, oh, the Democratic Party had these arcane rules and I couldn't figure it out. In fact, he was like, can you postpone your interview because I'm going to be on vacation or out of town or something when you're having it? And it's just like, come on, people. We're not in secret. We do the best that we can to make sure that anybody who wants to run for office knows that we are an endorsing organization. But for Christ's sake, we endorse and get involved in local city council races. If you'd like to be involved in city council, you could figure that out. And you could figure that out when you have your epiphany that you want to get involved in politics, surrounded by like professional and semi-professional political people. So I just don't sympathize with it, because here's the thing. We always hear the same complaints from just the people who we don't endorse. Right. And let's be real, like you and I go back on this, right? Yeah. Don't you remember when somebody ran for city council, went through our endorsement process? We didn't endorse them. We endorsed somebody else for city council. And his argument was he was discriminated against because he was like a white male. And we were like all affirmative action and we're going to screw white men. Then you fast forward, same structure, same process. And now the thing is like, oh, like a certain class or certain kind of like middle class white women aren't getting enough power or juice or endorsements. I'm sorry, but it's like, what? And this idea, the fact is that you're talking about, I just can't think of an example where somebody who really was a disenfranchised person out there. Come on, Josh, this is a community where there's a whole part of the community, the Latino plurality of the community, who face real systematic barriers to participation and power in this community. You have people living with disabilities that keep them from being very engaged in the community. You have people who work 6 jobs or whatever, of whatever racial background, and of lots of ages because of the high cost of living in this town. And it's like, those people are never the ones who are like, oh, the Democratic Party, ignored my desire to run for office or whatever, right? It's always people that actually have really well-connected friends. So yeah, look, the fact is we make endorsements, we make them based on politics and policy and viability and a whole bunch of things. And, different outcomes happen in different elections. We do the best that we can, but it's not a machine, for Christ's sakes. People keep using that word. And it's like, as someone who lived in Chicago and studies political parties, like, it's just nothing like a machine.
Is there
it's a bunch of volunteers with actually really, go ahead.
Can you acknowledge any sort of strategy in the sense of, oh, I know you want to run for this seat now, but you're not in line for this seat, so we want you to wait or run for this seat, and then eventually we're going to support you for this bigger seat? Can you acknowledge, does that situation happen? I could throw out a Greg Hart situation. He's going to get the supervisor seat one day if you don't do this prior to that? I mean, does that sort of happen? And is there anything right or wrong about that process? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does kind of happen kind of the way that you're describing it. And this is good. I'm glad. Let's get into it because like this is the kind of thing that I like voters should know more about and understand more, because when it gets distilled into like the comment section of a local blog or whatever, it's just like gets so mangled because like there's all these conspiracies and whatever. Okay, so here's the deal, right? Is like people in politics that are politicians and people outside of politics or whatever, they have ambitions and they're like, I want to be elected to city council, or, you know, someday I want to be president of the United States. So I've got it all mapped out, you know, and there's like different extremes on either side. Now, between you and me and everybody listening, there is a kind of rule of thumb, and I think this is true like in society, right? In general, is like often the people that are the most, hey, me, I should do this, I've got ambitions, are not the best, and the people that are you have to drag kicking and screaming into doing things are like really great. And that's super gendered, as we know, like so much that women are much less likely to be like wake up one morning and be like, I should be county supervisor. I mean, I don't know, I haven't done any politics or anything, but look at me, I'm awesome. Like that's a way, some women do it, of course, but that's way more of a dude move. So okay, so that's the reality. So you've got people ambitious and they want to make plans. And the party isn't in any position, by the way, to like tell anybody what to do. At the end of the day, they're going to file for whatever the hell office they want to or not, or do this. They each have to go out and fundraise a bunch. They all have to work their asses off anyway. So, you know, we don't get to dictate those things. What we get to do or have to do is like navigate all of those ambitions in a way that allows the party, once there's a field of candidates, to endorse based on policy and politics. So we could pretend that like that nobody makes decisions about whether to run before we make endorsements, and pretend that once our endorsement happens, it's like it's like Survivor, and whoever we vote for stays and everybody else goes. Like we could pretend we have that kind of power, in which case nobody in the party should be part of any conversations like before the endorsement or something, right? I don't know. We'd be like the Cardinals, the College of Cardinals, and you'd know we endorsed a mayor candidate because, you know, white smoke came from the headquarters, something like that. But that's not reality. Like the reality is, somebody's thinking of running, they want to know who else is running, they're maybe want to put a feeler out there and see this, and that's life, all of those things. So if you're like the chair of the party, you're in this weird situation because you don't want there on election day to be 82 Democrats running for something. That's bad for the party. And it's like in our bylaws and in our charter of what we're supposed to do is like to avoid that situation. At the same time, you want to give the party board and the clubs and the party organization a chance to, you know, have a say and vet these candidates. You know, let's say there's 2 Democrats that want to run for county supervisor. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of groups and people that are not Democratic Party organizations that really matter. And you want to have a say too. Feminist organizations, environmental groups, labor, of course. And so, and they all have different timetables. Some of them endorse like at the end of the election when it's all but decided. You know, others endorse really early. Okay, so that's the jungle of strategic reality. So what used to happen is that, and this was a tradition that was kind of started during the big supervisor wars of the 90s, the big fights for control over the county's the board of supervisors, where a coalition of, you know, like moderate Republicans who were environmentalists all the way to very lefty Democrats all worked together to make sure that Democrats were elected to the county board of supervisors. And when there was a decision about who was going to be the candidate, dude, this was the process. A group of people were invited to the Flax's house, to Dick and Mickey Flax's house. And these are people I love, right? I'm not talking shit on anybody, right? But they were invited there, and so they could all sit and hash it out and kind of decide who would be the candidate. So that was the kind of norm when I got involved in local party politics or local politics. Okay, I think I love the Flaxes, but we ended up agreeing on this very much, both Dick and Mickey, that's just like not like that's better than nothing as a system instead of just the Wild West and everybody runs, but it's not good. Like, who's not in the room? How do we hold accountable who is in the room? All of those things. And so over the years, I've really pushed to have these discussions happen in organizations by boards who are elected, you know, so, and then between representatives of boards. So instead of like, I know a guy and I know this person and that person's my friend, it's like the party chair could talk to the head of SEIU. If it was a school board race, the party chair could check in with the local teachers union, see, hey, what are you thinking? Who's out there? All of that. So there's this informal time before an election where it's like candidate recruitment, and the party doesn't really actually have a very formal candidate recruitment like program. And part of it is because this is also difficult. But the point is, there's a time where people are like thinking of running, people are asking people to run, and there's now, it's good, there's multiple sources and hubs of where candidates come from. So somebody might be active with Cause, you know, formerly Pueblo, and become a candidate that way, or active in a PTA group, right, especially for ed politics. And then what the party chair does for months and months and months is just like go around and talk to people. Hey, who do you know about what's going on with this? Who's thinking about running? And then obviously this is something that never used to happen, paying attention to the politics on the actual boards. Because man, this used to be like, who's your friend and I support you, with nothing about how people were voting. So now it's like, okay, what are the fights that are happening in City Hall? What are the fights that are happening in school boards? Like who's backing up the fight for representation and social justice in our school system? Who's playing footsie with the reactionaries? In ed policy, on the school boards and in the community college board, right, our politics are very obviously up for argument and debate. Anyway, point is, we pay attention to what's going on. We have discussion ongoing as a party community about what's going on and are engaged in the policy fights. Then we start to talk about the candidates. And yeah, there are a lot of tendencies for, hey, let's just have a very small conversation among a small group of people. But my experience is that the formal party actually draws all of that stuff out to the surface and makes it public and accessible. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I guess you could say, too, you look at the Republican Party and what happens when you don't have an organized campaign to interview and vet candidates. You get Charles Cole, who, assembly seat's usually an important seat. And, it's sort of like Charles Cole, maybe, whatever, you can criticize him. I have to stay my journalism role here, but, he's a young guy and doesn't really have a whole lot of experience. He can't be the best that the Republicans have to put up there, but yet he's the guy at the end of the day who's doing it. And I guess you could say, well, do you want something like that?
Yeah, well, I mean,
that's not much better, right?
Right, and the thing, and that's why I ask, when people are like, don't good candidates slip through, and I'm like, maybe, and maybe good candidates have. I mean, I know my own opinion. We've had endorsement questions where there's, two candidates, and I've been on the losing side, or three candidates more likely, and I'm on the losing side. But the thing is that there's this inevitable set of things that have to happen to avoid splitting the vote and giving seats to Republicans. So we've got to narrow the field. Second, we really do want to hold elected officials accountable to being good Democrats. And that means, that they go through our process and then they come back to us after they've been in office. And look, I got to say, the proudest I've ever been of political work that I've ever done has been just the last couple of years of watching the Democratic Party when I'm no longer chair. I'm not saying I don't have a vote on it or people don't listen to me or I live in a cocoon, but I'm not in on the day-to-day discussions, and watching a new generation of leaders emerge, young people and older people who weren't leaders before, like make these really sophisticated and I think very strategically sound decisions, like defending some incumbents very, very vigorously from attacks by other Democrats. And then in other cases, going after an incumbent who's been politically terrible. Mm-hmm. That's what I was trying to get to all along, is like a rational set of decisions where it's not just we defend every Democrat because they happen to check the box and say they're a Democrat. It's the easiest fucking thing in the world to do in Santa Barbara, California. How are you actually going to vote on important issues? So we're able to do that, distinguish between Democrats, but also be like, look, and probably you want to talk about the mayor's race. I think this is an example, but it's also like, just because you want to be in an elected office doesn't mean you get to waste everybody's time and money running against an incumbent Democrat who's doing a good job.
Mm-hmm. So yeah,
you got to prove that they're doing a bad job.
Let's transition there. Let's talk about the mayor's race coming up, because you've got Cathy Murillo. She's a former journalist, and she made the transition to city council, and then she got elected mayor. And she had a really high-profile, controversial, bad moment during the Black Lives Matter protest. Where she she got into an altercation, a verbal altercation with the organizers, and she did not come out looking very good in that situation. And I don't know where you were that day. I was there. I was, taking photos and writing a story, and it ballooned into a thing where Cathy Murillo didn't want to take a knee. And then it sort of turned into this thing of, where has she been? We've organized for you. We've knocked on doors for you, and we still have all these problems, and you're not doing your job. And that was a big deal for her. And then the next subsequent city council meetings, you had a lot of people calling in and just trashing her publicly during public comment.
Yeah.
And so
that was brutal.
That was really interesting for me, because covering it, that moment was very dynamic. When you're talking about activism and activists rising up and doing the work of trying to make change, we saw that day, right? Mm-hmm. But then the way that it sort of plays out is against this first Latina mayor in Santa Barbara, who for the most part has always advocated for the causes of working class people in Santa Barbara. And so it's like, how did we end up with this situation where she's being villainized? And then you've got, of course, all the usual people who aren't going to like a candidate or elected official like her, who are going to, criticize her as being bad for business. Okay. Somebody who doesn't want to do enough for the homeless. So she's got all those sort of built in.
Against the homeless.
Right. So, she's got all of that. Can you talk a little bit about the mayor, and like, did she do a bad job? And what do you think of that moment that went down where she didn't take a knee right there in front of everybody? She did later, but not in that moment.
Right. Yeah, that was interesting. And I also was not there at the time. And so I experienced it more via comments, things written on social media by some of the activists, the Black Lives Matter activists, who I adore and respect and am grateful to and inspired by. And then talking to Cathy, and then talking to some of them again, and then sort of piecing it together afterwards. And it is like a really interesting story, right? And a good example of the, why I often say, politics is an art and not a science, and there's difficult nuances. But here's the thing. The thing that I said before about there needing to be a political project, the Democratic Party, some kind of reformist politics that is willing to hold elected officials accountable is policy focused, right? And like really looks at their record, so they don't get a pass just because they're a Democrat. The flip side of that, right, is it's also not about symbolic politics and, who says the most radical thing. You got to look at the record, and you got to look at the whole political context and environment, right? And that's kind of what you were getting at, is that, so my argument, and I argued with them. I mean, I engaged with them because they're activists trying to make good change in the world, but that doesn't mean that everything that comes out of their mouth is right and true. And I was like, look, Cathy Murillo like spilled a lot of political capital, a lot of political blood in challenging the police department over her career politically. She just got out of a fight for a campaign for state office where it was, the whatever you want to call it, law and order, tough on crime garbage that was thrown at her was, that was the main line of attack. And what really went down there, was it about opposition to police reform, or was it about you wanted her to say a certain thing at a certain time and she didn't, and she was like next to police when you didn't want her to be, and all of that? All of those are reasons maybe to be mad at her as well, but like, let's just keep them separate. And so, and I said the same thing to Cathy. Like, I don't know why didn't you roll up with the police there were a whole bunch of questions I had about what she did too, but she's a human being, and she's the mayor of Santa Barbara, not the, the general secretary of NATO. And she's going to make diplomacy mistakes, and they shouldn't be the thing that is the axis of politics in Santa Barbara. So, but here, all of that said is, if people have complaints about Cathy's votes, or where she puts, the kind of city spotlight and focus, because she doesn't actually have control over city resources unilaterally. It's not a strong mayor system. So if people have concerns, bring them to bear when Cathy comes to get endorsements for things. What I say to young people getting active in Santa Barbara, is like, hey, actually, we spent like 20 years building some structures so you can use them to move the agenda you want. That was what I think my generation of party activists here did, starting in the early 2000s, So if they are mad at Cathy about policy, there's a whole bunch of ways to jam her up about it and try to push her to change, or get her to say things. So anyway, that to me, it was like kind of framed as like the end of the world, and this is we're seeing into Cathy Murillo's soul, and I think it wasn't that.
So what about Deborah Schwartz? So let's like to talk specific. So you've got Cathy Murillo, who's running for re-election, and I turned off my video temporarily for the Wi-Fi, but you got Deborah Schwartz running, and she's over there saying things like we need a course correction, and she's the one to sort of come in and save things, and save things. Does that just infuriate you? I mean, here you've got Deborah Schwartz, whose mother is sort of a legend of Democratic politics a generation ago, very well known, very prominent. She's going to run. She's going to get a lot of votes. Deborah herself is definitely, she's formidable. She's smart. She knows her stuff. I don't think she can beat Cathy. I don't know that the city's ready to pick her if they're going to pick somebody else over Cathy. But what does that do to you when you hear I'm running against the incumbent Democrat mayor as a party person? How do you react to that?
Well, so in this particular case, how does that make me feel? I chuckled when I heard it, because it just seems like just pure wanting to be mayor and like nothing more. And also I chuckled because of the conversations I had with Deborah when she was a candidate endorsed by the Democratic Party, and the current mayor, Helene Schneider, who never wanted to endorse Democratic candidates because having a strong party meant she didn't get to make all the decisions about who got to do everything. That was a long struggle. Anyway, back in those days, Deborah was all about like, oh, the party, and this is the sacred party endorsement. It came down from the heavens. All of the tribes have come together for this endorsement. So she can't, buck the will of the people. And then what? Now it's like, we need a course correction. Screw Cathy. So that's true, man. I mean, because I guess they tell on themselves, because often this is in writing, but just the number of politicians that I've dealt with all over the state who, in an election where they have the party on their side and somebody's going against them, they're just like, burn the heretic. And then they'll flip. If it's good for them, they'll flip and be like, the party is a closed system, and I'm here to open it up by running anyway. Yes, those are the thoughts of frustration that go through my mind. But when I hear that some in 17-term incumbent congressperson in a safe blue seat who votes crappily on labor and trade and doesn't represent their constituents is being challenged by a progressive candidate of color with good ideas that wants to shake shit up, then I'm like, hey, great, snooze you lose, I hope you win.
Yeah.
But the other key there is one very important nerdy difference there that's very important to anybody who's like strategically partisan, and that is, what is the mechanism of the actual election? Partisan primaries, the thing that Californians love to vote to destroy, they actually allow the party to hash this stuff out and let people participate and see what happens, and then go to the general election not worried about flipping it to a Republican. But all these stupid things like top two or nonpartisan elections like we have at the local level, those actually mean that the party has to do all these maneuvers to try to avoid that. I mean, I said when top two was passed, I think I even said to you, maybe on the record for a newspaper, like, ironically, this just pushes the party into the smoky rooms because we have to avoid the pileup. So it's dumb. It's better to just acknowledge parties exist, let things be partisan, and sorry, that means that I just want to be mayor or I just want to be a county supervisor doesn't cut it. It just doesn't cut it as a reason.
Did the party, I mean, you've alluded to it a couple times, so I'm just going to go there. Did the party have any problem endorsing Laura Capps for education for school board coming after that supervisor's race, where it caused a lot of heart?
It's hard to say. That's the kind of thing where it's like, I think it did for some individual people on the board.
Yeah. I
mean, it was hard. It was a hard vote, but there was no discussion, and it wasn't at all lopsided. And I think some people, there might've been a couple people who like abstained or didn't vote or something or whatever. But anyway, point is that that's a really good example though of where, for one thing, the party isn't like a brain in a jar. So it's a group of people, it's people. So there were different opinions about it. Yeah. But I think what you could deduce as what was the kind of average opinion was, and was reflected in the endorsement vote and in the campaign was, we're partisan and we take this stuff actually seriously. There's a right-wing threat happening in local government, and we don't want to split the vote and like let a reactionary, like a Trumpist, win a seat. And we care about that. Not everybody cares about that in every race, and not everybody thinks that way all the time, but we have to all the time. So we can't afford to do like personal vindictiveness. And man, look at our history. I mean, look at all the personalities that have come through and like who's flipped around, right? Ea Falcone, right? Not my best friend for many years. Then like we were buddies, and she was like for a long time a really good supporter of all things Democratic and came out for progressives that were definitely to her left, to be partisan. And I think she really, we grew more similar in that sense over the years. But very different kind of people and from different kind of wings of the party. And so it's not this. Don't you remember like how things were back then, like sort of before Pueblo and before the party got more organized?
Mm-hmm.
That so much shit in Santa Barbara was just about like who liked who,
Mm-hmm.
who had supported who.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that person didn't support me for dog catcher, so there's no way I'm going to support her for mayor. And like that is the resting point, the default of nonpartisan politics. We came in and disrupted that default. And is that still there? Of course. But I mean, some of the toughest conversations I have, right, are with elected officials to get them to endorse when I was chair. I don't have to do this anymore, thank God. But one of the things you got to do when you're a party chair is like, hey, supervisor, you really need to support our candidates for school board. And you hear the stuff, it's never ideological. If it was ideological or about policy, like people usually don't fight about it. They're like, okay, fine, fair enough. But the objections are things like, well, that person didn't support me when I first ran for blah, blah, or that person hired that person who ran against me. I mean, the petty shit persists. And you just have to be like, dude, it doesn't matter. Like they're the Democrat in the race, or it doesn't matter. Like we've got labor and environment working together for these candidates. Like you can't, come on, it can't be about you.
Let's talk.
And everybody's done that to me. Everybody's done. All of my friends who are in politics, everybody's pulled some garbage, bullshit, personal card of like, oh, we're just close friends. So it's universal. It's a thing about politicians.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about you, and let's talk about a thing about politicians, because this. I think I frustrate you a little bit. I mean, I've said over the years, Daraka, you're better than the candidates that you support, that you endorse. You're smarter, you're more knowledgeable, you're a better communicator, you're more well researched. Like, why don't you run? I know you're an elected official, but we'll get there. But why don't you run for some of these seats? School board, city council, assembly. When there's a million videos of you on YouTube, and you're projecting to these large crowds, and you're a dynamic speaker, but more so, you really know how to connect with an audience. And like, let's talk about you a little bit. Like, tell me why you're more comfortable as somebody who's helping to build the party, as opposed to being the guy who is out there. We know you can do it. We know you're capable of it. Why don't you just do it yourself?
I don't know whether it's like some kind of like Protestant, self-doubt or self-control from my mom's side, or or being raised on my dad's side by someone who was raised in poverty, and came to the United States to join and be part of a struggle for better world for everybody, and was like really motivated by that. So the values that I have are just not, they're about getting power for regular people. Like that's just what motivates me. So I'm more interested in building organizations and movements and institutions that make all of the elected officials better and more accountable and more principled, and getting money, making money less of the issue and personal favors less of the issue and all of those things. If I just feel like I accomplish more if I have that impact on all of the elected officials versus just being an elected official who, does better rather than worse. That's not to say like I would never run for office or do that or whatever, and it's certainly not to say I don't appreciate the people who do. I've talked a lot of shit about politicians, and I always will. And all the local politicians who I work with, and politicians I work with around the state who know me, know that I like them a lot and I appreciate their work. And I'll also give them shit to their face. It's because I think there needs to be a countervailing force in American society to the kind of independent, like personality-driven power of politicians. And so I guess there's so many things wrong in the world, Josh. I mean, there's so many things to fight. There's so many things to do to change, to make things better. I guess between my own experience as an organizer and an activist and my academic research, I've just kind of focused on like the thing I think I can do is use whatever abilities I have and energy I have to fix this problem in American politics, that the parties themselves are too weak and the politicians are too strong.
So let's talk a little bit. You are
look at the other side. Sorry, just to finish that. I mean, it's not just the Democratic Party, right? I think the party being too weak on the Democratic side means we have a money-driven politics and a personality-driven politics. On the Republican side, I mean, don't we all, the whole world was expecting something called the Republican Party to emerge during their primary and be like, no, like we're not a just blatantly racist, populist, lunatic party. We're some other kind of lunatic party. But anyway, we were expecting the Republican adults to do something, and they couldn't. So the problem in American politics isn't too much partisanship or too much parties.
So you are the vice chair of the California Democratic Party, and you are running for re-election. So let's talk about what that role is and what it means to you, and what it is that you're doing on that statewide level to make change.
Yeah, well, so kind of concurrently with being a local party activist and leader, I started to get involved in the state party 10, 15 years ago, and I've served in different roles there, and always trying to be a voice for that, I think that razor that I talked about before that cuts both ways, that we should be a party that is like a normal political party that supports candidates based on principles and how they do in office, will withhold that support if they go off the rails, and goes out and campaigns for the candidates we've endorsed. Like as just a bottom line, that's what we should do. And so, I've tried to make alliances in the party with people who agree with that, whether they, no matter who they supported in a primary, or if they identified as a progressive or a moderate. That has been a treacherous strategy, I have to say personally, because the state party, like the national party, has just been so divided along, Bernie, anti-Bernie, or, Bernie, Hillary, or, I'm a progressive or I'm not, or I'm a progressive too, or yelling at each other. I mean, there's just these like lines, and also divided between kind of people who think of themselves as grassroots and the leadership. And so, and my politics is very left politically and ideologically, but is also very pro institution, building the party institution, but building it independently from the politicians. So it's a tough sort of road to walk. So like I ran for chair a year ago, a little more than a year ago, 2 years ago, I guess. And, I got walloped. I thought that, I could be like, some of the pragmatists in the party, they'll like me because I know how to run a party. But the left, I mean, I'm a lifelong socialist. Like, they know where I stand. So, best of both worlds. But I was more like the man without a country.
Now, you mentioned, you're like the socialist, and, you're somebody who's kind of, off on an island within the state party structure. Do you're probably not going to believe this, but I've spent plenty of conversations to my media friends defending you because you can be a little bit polarizing, as you know. That's an understatement, I guess. There are people who will say that the Democratic Party or style politics is very heavy-handed, and then I'm over here on the other hand saying, like, okay, have you heard this guy talk? Have you heard what this guy has to say? Have you heard the fact that he's a local guy who grew up here, who's back in this community, wanting to give back, and could be anywhere else? Can you talk a little bit about your sort of like your mentors and like your teachers? I know Dick Flax is super influential in your life. Can you talk about your father or others who you turn to? I mean, obviously you mentioned that you ran and you lost. That's impactful. You have to bounce back from that. No matter how smart you are, you still feel that. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to bounce back from that setback, and who are your mentors?
Yeah, that's great. Well, first I would say, as a socialist, I actually feel much less isolated in the state party or like in a bubble than I ever did in any time in my life. I mean, that's the great thing that's happened in all the tumult of the last couple of years, is that, the center of gravity in the party has shifted quite a bit to the left. And from my perspective, that's good. And, people don't bat the same number of eyelashes, I should say, at somebody being a socialist. Like, it's not a socialist party. Socialist politics are not the majority in the Democratic Party, despite what, the QAnon people say. But it's also not relegated to the lobby the way that it was 10 years ago, for a lot of reasons, which could be a whole other podcast. But but it's more actually this, like that thing that people say I'm heavy-handed or abrasive or whatever. I think that actually, personality critique aside, as a politics, I think that's how I've been isolated lately in the state party, which is that I'm actually like, I don't suffer bullshit. And in Santa Barbara politics, there was just so much of a culture of politeness to your face, real sniveling kind of dishonesty of like, oh, if I say this thing back to you in a way that's kind of like what you said, then this conversation's over. I think it was really patronizing. I think it was really white. And I think in a complicated way, because this community has been a pioneer of sort of living feminism. There are a lot of women in power and so forth. And I think that there's like, those things about white feminism that people have noted, or worldwide, of like a kind of inability to check one's privilege, that makes things complicated here. So all of those things is like, I'm not saying every time every word that's come out of my mouth is justified and I'm the best human being ever and I'm the Buddha or whatever, but like, honestly, you want to talk about mentors, one of my a person who was technically my employee, but and a sort of colleague, but was a big mentor of mine here locally, was a guy named Chris Lanier, who didn't live here that long, but he really made a very big impact. And one of the things that guy would remind me all the time, he was an organizer for the Democratic Party. He worked for Hannah Beth on her Senate race, and then eventually worked for several years for Cause, and really helped them develop their political program. But he would always remind me, I'd really internalize, and people would be like, Daraka, you need to learn how to talk to older women better, and you're just too gruff and mean. And I'd be like, oh, maybe that's true. And, I mean, I should check myself as a man, and all of that, all still true. But, Chris would be like, dude, they lost a political battle and they're mad at you about that. Like, remember that. Like, you had a political fight over like who should be in power and over what issues we should fight for. And you guys were conflicted over the gang injunction. Just remember, like, even if they're saying like, oh, you should be nice to your elders or whatever, like, you had a political conflict with your elders and you beat them, and they're going to be mad about it. And so just sort of like learning how to manage the sort of emotional labor of like what kind of criticism to take in and really take seriously, and what kind of criticism is just fucking politics, right? It's just like, they lost the vote and they're mad. That's a challenge I'm still dealing with, but it's been important. And so, people like Dick Flax, obviously my wife Hillary, even folks I argue with all the time, like Doss Williams, who's like a good foil from kind of the politician side, can be really like helpful for keeping sane in that. One thing about being a Democratic Party leader that's different than a lot of other kinds of things is like, you're always wrong. I mean, it's always your fault. If elections go badly, it's the party's fault. If they go well, it's the politicians. And so, you're always just sort of annoying to somebody. Growing up here, was a real blessing. I think you'd agree. It was just a really great place to grow up for people our generation. I'm not saying it isn't now. I just know less about being a young person. But, just the I think a real sweet spot of size, distance, closeness to LA, but distance from LA. I found it to be quite a diverse community growing up because of the part of the town I grew up in the Ladera apartments, and then over in the country club apartments on the east side and the west side, in working class neighborhoods that were as racially diverse as Santa Barbara gets. And so I don't think of it as just like a playground for the most wealthy, but also like, all kinds of interesting, affluent people of the ones who are affluent, artists and people, creative types from Hollywood and so forth. It's just made like a really interesting, wonderful mix. It's my hometown. Do I think it's, so much better and special and important than any other town in California? No, I don't. I'm not a Santa Barbara chauvinist, but I like it, and I'm glad I moved back, and we'll continue to fight to be able to live here.
So I got about 4 minutes left. Let me ask you this. Joe Biden, as we talk, is about to take office. Is the country all of a sudden better now? Do we have Trump gone, but actually the people who believe in him are actually going to now take this country, they're going to carry on with sort of what they learned from him? What's the state of the country from your political perspective, and how worried should we be?
Oh, yeah.
In 4 minutes.
We end on a small note. So, I'm terrible at predictions. I hate doing predictions. And as you know, like, because you're always like, hey, handicap this race for me. And I'm like, and and then on top of it, like 2016, I tried to do a prediction. I told everybody, there's all kinds of video of me being like, no way Donald Trump wins the nomination. He's like got this little spurt going on, but as I just said before, I was like, the adults, they're going to figure it out. I was so wrong, right? Then I was like, oh, Hillary's got this. Come on. Like, whatever. All the criticism aside, she's going to beat Trump. And then she didn't. So, fuck. I'm out. I'm just like done with the prediction game. But better is a relative term. I think the minute that Biden gets the nuclear codes and starts to make appointments and make decisions, the country's better. It's better. But like the things that we need to fix, the police brutality, economic inequality, the lack of any industrial policy, continued gender inequality, all the things that we've got to really tackle as a country, the climate, like those things don't automatically get fixed or even get better because Biden gets in. There's a lot of work that will have to be done. Lastly, as you said, yeah, I don't think Trumpism goes away. It's still the most powerful force in the Republican Party. 200 Republicans voted like with the coup. So they have a lot of work to do to figure out if they want to rejoin the United States or continue to be this like treacherous lunatic party.
All right, Daraka Larimore-Hall, I really appreciate your time. We got into like a third of what I wanted to talk to you about, so we're gonna have.
So did I talk too much?
No, we're just gonna have to do it again. I was wanting you to do some media bashing and talk about them, but I think we're out of time. But no, it's always a pleasure. It's nice to have this conversation with you, and let's do it again soon if you're up for it. And
absolutely.
Thanks a lot for taking the time. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you.